All right, in this video, we're going to talk about AMD's announcement of RDNA 2 and the 6000 series graphics cards. Now, we're going to touch lightly on the actual architectural specs that they changed, but what I really want to focus on is the FPS charts that they mentioned, because I always like to take marketing material and look at those things with a little bit of scrutiny and somewhat skepticism. You never really know where those numbers are exactly coming from, how truthful they're being, especially in this case where they're not actually providing the competition's numbers. They're only providing their own numbers for FPS. So in an effort to either back up their claims or potentially prove them wrong and show that there might be a little bit of marketing hype going on behind the scenes here, I went ahead and gathered our own numbers. Luckily, I have some very fortunate friends that were able to grab Founders Edition 3080s. And I do have my own 2080 Ti, which they used for comparisons for the 6800, as the 3070s are not out yet. And I did have to rely on posted scores for 3090 because personally, I just don't know anyone that has one yet. What I want to do is take a subsample of their tests. I mean, they posted a total number of scores for 10 different games. We're going to focus in on 3 games that I was able to either benchmark myself using my machine or with the help of my friends Pro Superhero and Gunner. Thank you very much for lending their 3080s to the test. So we're going to see if these numbers are actually valid. Before that, if you're not following me on Twitch, you can do so every Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, starting at 9:30 p.m. Pacific time, where I'll be streaming and talking about discussions of the new upcoming hardware, what AMD is presenting to the table. Are they actually giving NVIDIA a run for their money right now? So if you can, go ahead and you can join us over there on the link down below, and we'll see you there. But at this point, let's try and make this one quick, and we'll jump right into the numbers. Okay, so first off, before we touch on the architectural changes or the actual scores that AMD posted, can we talk about this guy's shirt? I mean, Scott Herkelman, I love your shirt. Up, up, down, down, left, right, B, A, start. Kids, if you don't know, go look it up. But that's awesome. I like it. I dig it. I'm pretty happy about that. Now, AMD introduced the 6800, the 6800 XT, as well as the 6900 XT, basically one-to-one comparisons or competition for the 3070, 3080, and 3090 from NVIDIA. Now, a lot of their scores were pretty interesting. I mean, in some cases, they were absolutely besting NVIDIA's GPUs. So what I wanted to do is take a quick look at how those scores lined up. I'm not going to go over all of the specific details for each of the different cards as far as game clocks, boost, all that. It's all going to be relative to the cards, and in some ways, those are not a direct one-to-one comparison to what NVIDIA is offering. But what I did want to touch on is some interesting topics here. First off, they're introducing something called Rage Mode, which is essentially their own kind of built-in overclocking. Now, from what I have heard from other media sources is that Rage Mode doesn't actually increase the clock for either the core or the memory. What it does do is increase the overall power limit for the card. What that allows the card to do is maintain higher boost speeds for a longer period of time by being able to sustain a higher power limit. Obviously, you need a strong enough cooling solution to be able to handle the increased power load. However, it is something that they're saying can increase performance almost up to 8%, which is definitely significant. Now, the other thing they're introducing is something called Smart Access Memory, and this comes into play when you're using it alongside an AMD CPU. If you have an AMD CPU and AMD GPU, Smart Access Memory, or SAM as people are calling it, essentially creates a bridge between the CPU and the GPU, creating essentially a high-speed highway direct to the GPU memory. This is something that you're only going to be able to take advantage of if you are using an AMD CPU paired with their GPU. Now, the overall gain from early reports is roughly 1% to 2%, but it is something that you're going to want to use in conjunction with their Rage Mode. Can we also talk about Rage Mode? What? Rage Mode? I mean, I get it, but like GPU boost? Nah, I guess that's kind of boring. Power, super, no. Okay, Rage Mode it is. The other thing AMD introduced was their ultimate latency reduction technology. I'm not going to go into the details there, but it is interesting that they are also looking at competitions for NVIDIA Reflex technology. And lastly, before we get into the numbers, one of the things that they also brought up is their next generation suite of visuals. Essentially what this is a suite of tools that developers can tap into, namely what they're calling their Fidelity Effects module. That includes things like a contrast adaptive sharpening, a denoiser, variable shading rates, ambient occlusion, screen space reflections, as well as super resolution, which at the time it sounded like they were still working on super resolution. But essentially what these are is a suite of tools that is going to allow game developers to leverage more of the hardware of the GPU to increase FPS and overall fidelity to the imagery. Okay, let's jump right into the numbers. And the first thing I wanted to do is actually organize these charts by game rather than by card family, since we are consolidating these down to 3 games, and those games being Division 2, Borderlands 3, and Shadow of the Tomb Raider. And I think, out of the 10 games, if we're seeing commonalities here, I think that we could assume that the rest of the results are either valid or invalid based off of our current findings. So first off, in Division, for the 6800, AMD was posting a frame rate score of 118. Now they were comparing this against the 2080 Ti because the 3070 FEs were not out yet at this time. So what I went ahead and did was actually used my setup with my i9900KF and my 2080 Ti. I did remove the overclock because I did want to start it off at a base level. Now granted, my card is a Strix version. It is not the Founders Edition card. So I'm not exactly sure which 2080 Ti they were comparing this against. I'm assuming it's a Founders Edition. But again, we'll see how our scores line up here. So as compared to their 118 FPS for Division 2 for the 6800, the 2080 Ti came in at 105. Now that roughly falls right in line where apparently the NVIDIA GPU bar chart extends to on AMD's graph. And this is where I actually wish they had given us some real numbers. But let's go ahead, we'll make our own estimations, we'll compare them to the charts that they have, and we'll move through the rest of the cards here. So the 6800 XT came in at 135 frames per second for AMD. The 3080, based on our own benchmarks, came in at 131 frames per second. Now, that's actually lower than what AMD posted. So I'm kind of curious. I mean, they're roughly looking at posting a score of 140 frames per second. We tested this multiple times, and this test was actually done on a 10900K. Again, no overclock on the 10900K and no overclock on the GPU, but that came in at 131. Now, I'm curious, I'm sure they were testing these with their new AMD chip. Now, this could be interesting because this may be showing that the 3080s may actually see a boost in performance with the latest AMD chips over the 10900K, if that's what they use for testing. Moving up to the 6900 XT, AMD posted a score of 81 frames per second. Now, granted, these scores were actually done at 4K, where all of the other testing was done at 1440p. The 3090 FE came in at a score of 78 frames per second, again, which is lower than AMD's posted score. So overall, that's kind of interesting because in some ways they gave the benefit of the doubt to NVIDIA on both of those games where our scores actually came in lower. For Division 2, we had 2 scores come in lower than AMD's posted score for NVIDIA and one that pretty much seemed spot on. Now, one last area that I did test is what their Rage Mode score was against a overclocked 2080 Ti. Now, AMD didn't give us scores for every game with Rage Mode enabled. I'm not exactly sure why they didn't do a one-to-one comparison, but they gave us scores for 7 games. And one of the games is one that we are testing here, which is Borderlands 3. But what I did to actually extrapolate this for the other games was I took the average. So what they gave us was Borderlands 3 with a 6% improvement, and this includes both Rage Mode with Smart Access Memory. Doom Eternal came in at a plus 2%. Forza Horizon 4 came in at 13%. Gears of War 5 came in at 8%, as well as Hitman 2 at 8%. Resident Evil 3 came in at 4%, and Wolfenstein Youngblood came at 4%. So if we go ahead and average those values, we come in at 6.43%. So as a baseline, I applied those to Division 2 and Shadow of the Tomb Raider 3. Take this with a grain of salt because it is an average value, but it should give you a rough idea of what kind of gains you expect to see. So the 6800 with Rage Mode for Division 2 would roughly come in at a score of 126 frames per second. Now, my 2080 Ti that is overclocked with plus 100 on the core and plus 1000 on the memory comes in at 116. So while I did see a higher boost on my overclock versus their Rage Mode, the 6800 actually still wins out in that by 10 frames per second. All right, let's move on to Borderlands 3. First off, AMD 6800 came in at 99 frames per second. Now, my 2080 Ti came in at 86 frames per second, which is roughly right in line for what AMD posted for a 2080 Ti. Moving up to the 6800 XT, AMD came in at 111 frames per second, and our 3080 came in at 115 frames per second, which is significantly higher than what AMD was showing in their chart. They were displaying the 3080 actually coming in behind the 6800 XT, where in our tests, we actually came out slightly ahead. And the same is true for the 3090 FE. AMD posted a score for their 6900 XT at 73 frames per second, but NVIDIA has posted scores for their 3090 at 76 frames per second. I mean, granted, we're all within a very tight margin of error. We don't know the exact specifications for these setups, so there might be some small margin of error there. It is very close, but again, that's why we're doing these tests. Now for Borderlands 3, it is interesting that once again, the 2080 Ti score that they posted relatively looks correct based off of their charts for NVIDIA. However, both the 3080 and the 3090 posted higher. Now, while we don't have a 3090 in our possession, we were able to consistently get scores better than AMD's 6800 XT on our 3080 system. So based on that, I'm going to believe the 3090 score as well. Now, again, looking at rage mode for the 6800, this is a case where AMD actually gave us the score. They were looking at a plus 6%, which comes in at 105 frames per second. And the overclocked 2080 Ti comes in at 94 frames per second. So again, they had a 6-frame boost. We had an 8-frame boost. The 6800 still bested the 2080 Ti in that case, even though we did have a higher boost to our overclock. And finally, let's move on to Shadow of the Tomb Raider. First off, the 6800 again with 136 frames per second. The 2080 Ti came in at 122 frames per second, which once again, for the 2080 Ti, those scores seem spot on. I mean, they seem to have nailed those benchmarks. Moving up to the 6800 XT, they posted a score of 155 frames per second. Our tests with our 3080 also came in at 155 frames per second. Now that is slightly higher than what AMD posted in their graphs with a tying score in that case. Now the 6900 XT posted a score of 96 frames per second at 4K, and the 3090 score posted by NVIDIA was coming in at 88 frames per second, which is actually lower than what AMD is showing. AMD actually has them tied at both 96. So again, this may be a case where the AMD CPUs is actually boosting the NVIDIA processors. Now, if we take one more look at rage mode for the 6800, that extrapolates out to 145 frames per second versus 131 frames per second for the 2080 Ti that's overclocked. In both of these cases, rage mode and the overclock on the 2080 Ti both boosted 9 frames per second, so that's an even climb for both GPUs. Now, if we look at the validity of the scores posted by AMD for the NVIDIA GPUs, it looks like for the 2080 Ti, they were spot on. Now, for the 3080, we had one score that was lower and 2 scores that were higher. And for the 3090, there were 2 scores that were lower and 1 score that was higher. I mean, overall, I was really impressed with the 2080 Ti scores. I mean, those seem to be almost spot on compared to their charts. So I have to say, for the most part, it looks like they're being incredibly accurate. And until we actually have the same exact system with an AMD CPU to test on, we're not going to know exactly how these scores are faring, because these scores could easily be swayed by some CPU influence as well. Okay, so now that we know the numbers, and we have a really good idea where these cards are coming in at, let's look at the average differences as well as the price point and see if these cards are worth everything that they say they are. Okay, so first off, for value comparison, obviously the 3090 to the 6900 XT, you're looking at a 33% increase in price for NVIDIA for what appears to be almost break-even performance. In the chart that they showed, the 6900 XT only bested the 3090 in 5 of the 10 games they showed. So let's just assume that it's an even playing field, and depending upon what games you're going to be playing, one card may be better than the other. At that point, why would you not buy AMD? I have reasons. I'm going to save them for the end. But again, that price point, it's not even close. I would say if you want that type of speed, go with AMD. Now, moving on to the 6800 XT and the 3080. The 6800 XT is coming in at a price point of $650, and the 3080 is coming in at $700. Now, for a $50 increase in price, it's pretty close. I mean, you're already spending $650. Is there a reason to spend the extra $50? Now, once again, the benchmarks are really close. right? We saw an increase in performance on Division of 3% for AMD. It was a dead heat for Shadow of the Tomb Raider. And for Borderlands 3, we had 3% in the other direction towards NVIDIA. So again, they're neck and neck. Depending upon the games that you're going to be playing, you're probably going to have one card might be slightly better than the other. I think at that point, it's a matter of preference. However, with that price point, the thing that you are not getting, and again, this is for a select subgroup of people, if you are using this card to stream and you are in a single PC, you cannot overlook the value of the NVENC encoder. AMD has not shown that they have done anything with their encoder to improve performance, and NVENC encoding is phenomenal. It's actually what I use for my streams now after looking at some of my old performance with using X264. And you can go back and actually check out that video if you want to see what type of FPS gains I had using NVENC. But at this point in time, I wouldn't use anything else. It's pretty fantastic, especially for a single PC streaming setup. So again, is there $50 in value of that for me? Yes. And so in that case, I would go with a 3080 over the AMD, essentially because the performance is almost 1-to-1. And at that point, I'm really just paying the extra $50 for the features that NVIDIA is providing me. All right, and lastly, we're going to look at the 6800 versus the 3070 FE, because to be honest, why would anybody buy a 2080 Ti at this point? So the 3070 FE is coming in at $500. The 6800 is coming in at $580. So it is about 16% more, or obviously $80 more in price. Now, you are seeing significant gains in performance over the 3070. I mean, at minimum, we were seeing 9% in Division 2, all the way up to 16% in Shadow of the Tomb Raider. So in this case, you're pretty much getting what you pay for. And again, unless you are looking for that NVENC encoder for streaming, this may be another case where AMD may actually be your best option. So overall, these numbers are pretty exciting because while there might have been some minor discrepancies here and there, for the most part, they fell pretty much in line with what AMD was presenting, which one is great. You know, I wasn't necessarily out to try and prove somebody wrong. What I wanted to do was just validate the results. And I think we were able to do that. What makes me really excited is the competition, right? What I don't want to see is Intel and NVIDIA get complacent, which while they've been making some great strides, especially on the NVIDIA side, I really want to see Intel come out the gate strong, because what this is doing, especially with the Smart Access memory bundle, you are now saying, hey, if you're going to buy an AMD GPU, it really is in your best interest to buy an AMD CPU, which is fantastic because it's really going to light a fire under Intel's butt to kind of see where they go next. I'm all about competition in the industry because at the end of the day, we're the ones that win. As technology progresses and those companies are competing more and more, that's just going to drive performance even farther. And at the end of the day, we're the ones that are going to reap the benefits. So at this point, I can't wait to see what NVIDIA does, if they have a response, if they're actually going to adjust pricing, if they're going to stick to their guns. Are they going to introduce a 3060 and the rumored 3080 Ti? And we'll see what Intel has to offer. I mean, they're talking about Rocket Lake coming out in the beginning of next year. So there'll be some interesting trends to keep an eye on. For the most part, my recommendation is still wait for all the information to be out in the world. Wait for these cards and the CPUs to get in the hands of reviewers. I can't wait to see head-to-head competition of AMD's top tier lineup for CPU and GPU against Intel and NVIDIA. I think it's all really exciting to see when those numbers start coming out and where everything falls into place. So as always, if you like the content we're providing, please like and subscribe. It's the best way to support the channel. We're going to keep doing this. We're going to follow this story as the chips come out. Hopefully we'll get more benchmarks on either side, and I can't wait to see how it all ends up. So until the next time, we'll catch you later.